Alright, this is something I want to been saying for a while, but when I talk about this sort of things, I think I have a kind of a weird disadvantage. You see, when I was in school and we did standardized testing, I always had I always scored very high in the reading comprehension things, like the top 90th percentile or something like that, but I only ever scored about average to the below average in the English ability, which means I understand anything I read, but I can't necessarily explain it. How is it that standardized testing has more nuance than this quote? Well, anyway, this just means that I might not be able to explain what I mean, but I do understand it. I'm just saying that that might lead to some problems when I'm trying to explain myself. I understand what's going on, but I might not necessarily be able to have the words to explain myself. Alright, moving on to it, I wanted to talk about some criticisms I've seen for The Last Jedi. Not the nitpicky, terrible ones, like, why are the bombs falling? Well, there's gravity on the ship, and objects in motion tend to stay in motion unless acted on by an outside force. You'd know that if you knew the first thing about physics. Because that is the first thing about physics. No, these are just two criticisms that I feel I can talk about and add something to, because a lot of people have already, because other people have already brought up some of the more,
Luke is drinking tit milk, triggered fools who don't get filmed,
let's say, dicey criticisms. First up is a video by a guy called Left Foot Media. I don't know anything about this guy other than this video. I saw it and then I never wanted to see the channel again. But it's called Who Was Right? Aragorn or Rose Tico? I don't think there's like one clip that shows like the thesis statement of his video, but his overall point is, and I'll link to it in the description, but his overall point seems to be, was Rose right when she said,
"That's how we're gonna win. Not fighting what we hate. Saving what we love."
Or was Aragorn right when he said,
"For Frodo"?
Well, actually, no, he was talking about the speech before that. Maybe this is a case, like I said earlier, of this thing just being a bit obvious to me and not having the ability to really explain it, but I mean, you do realize Lord of the Rings is literally all about that, right? It's not exactly subtle.
Shall be the Fellowship of the Ring.
Lord of the Rings is literally all about how you should fight, mostly for the people that you care about, not to be against the enemy. I've said this before, but ultimately in Lord of the Rings, orcs are treated like victims before they're treated like anything else. It's not that they're evil and you have to fight them because they're evil and you should hate them. You fight them because, well, if I don't, my buddy's gonna die. I could understand misunderstanding this if the first movie wasn't called Fellowship of the Ring. There's a constant motif of fellowship throughout the Lord of the Rings. So who was right? Yes, they agree. Granted, I think Lord of the Rings said it in a much better way, so yes, this line kind of didn't work with the motifs of the film. If you want to criticize it as saying, yeah, this line kind of didn't gel well with the rest of the motifs of the film, and it was just a little bit, cringy, and you could go about saying it, and you could go about saying in a much better way by just going,
For Frodo.
So there is some criticism to be had here. It's just you're misunderstanding Lord of the Rings to try and call a movie that you didn't like bad. Well, fine, if you don't like it, you don't like it. I'm not here to tell you that you can't, but that's a terrible reason not to like it. The second one is something I saw in an interview, and I can just find it, and I can just do a clip for it.
So I have worked my entire career to try and create characters with lasting, mythical import and power that will get into people's minds and stay there. And Last Jedi did a lot of things in very cool ways. But I don't know if I will ever be able to get over the fact that Luke Skywalker, who I consider the single greatest mythical character of the last 50 years, right? With the most weight and interest behind him, and basically throwing him away for shock value.
Yeah, that was Brendan Sanderson talking about The Last Jedi. And I got a few things to say about that. First, the greatest modern mythology is Lord of the Rings. Like, I don't think that's even debatable. What has Lord of the Rings inspired, like, mythologies that the old have?
There are songs on the ring which make me feel so down.
The point is, a large chunk of modern fantasy. What has Star Wars inspired? Firefly, elements of The Expanse. I can't think of anything else. I'm not calling Star Wars bad, but yeah, Lord of the Rings is a bit more mythological in comparison. Even if we're not counting Lord of the Rings, and we're counting things that just sort of, like a mythologies that sort of sprung up naturally, Lord of the Rings was made to be a mythology. Even then, I would say Star Wars is 4th place, maybe. It depends if you want to count DC and Marvel as separate, but I would say that either comic book universe has a greater sense of modern mythology to it than Star Wars. Granted, this is just an opinion, and maybe this is due to me being a millennial, not from Gen X. I can't really know what it was like in the theaters at the time, but yeah, Star Wars is at best 2nd or 3rd place. 2nd or 3rd place on the tiers of mythology. And yes, this has relevance to the overall point because the idea that this story can't work for characters on this that hit this mythological ideal, well, it has. Twice.
Logan, what did you do?
Charles, the world is not the same as it was.
All right, people, let's do this one last time. My name is Peter B. Parker.
All of these movies basically have the same story. A mentor figure that stops believing in himself, gaining one final act of redemption, mostly due to the admiration of a younger protege. Was that Wolverine? Was that Into the Spider-Verse? Or was that Last Jedi? It doesn't matter, they're all the same. I would say Spider-Man is definitely above Luke. Wolverine, maybe on par, maybe a bit lower, but the idea that it can't work for this level of a modern mythological character that's supposed to be just like a really good person. I guess Wolverine's kind of out, but still, Spider-Man. Like, you were disappointed that Luke was like this? Yeah. Now you know how Miles feels.
I think you're gonna be a bad teacher.
And even if we're not talking modern mythologies, this is not a new story in mythology. Like I've said before, Luke is mostly based on King Arthur more than anyone else, and King Arthur had that, depending on the writer, had that same story about having a few good years, then like lapsing into exile and shit, and then gaining one final act of redemption. Like, yeah, I don't know if this is by design or just due to the fact that Luke was always sort of a self-insertion character, if the name didn't make that already obvious. I mean, think about it. George Lucas's life somewhat fits this pattern. Modernized the film genre with Star Wars, made it into something that everyone hated.
No, not really, no.
Then did the only thing he could do to redeem himself. And this is not saying you have to like the movie because it was like other movies that everyone liked. You can say that there are problems with how this was done. Fine, I'm fine with listening to that. But the idea that it can't work, it has before, and it did after. Anyway, that's all I really wanted to say. If you liked the movie or you didn't, I hope you recognize that both of these criticisms aren't exactly, good.